Fructosamine is analogous to HbA1c in that there's a protein called albumin. Now, albumin is what we call a negative acute phase reactant.
Yes.
So now what does that even mean? So basically, in a normal existence, healthy existence, our liver produces lots of proteins, which is good because we need proteins to live. But when we're sick, we have other proteins that the liver produces, like C-reactive protein. That's an inflammatory protein. But there's a finite synthetic capacity in the liver. It can't just say, oh, I'm going to produce more CRP now and not subtract away from something else. So your albumin production will actually reduce when you're actually inflamed and chronically inflamed. And the change in albumin synthesis rate can actually impact on your fructosamine as well. So fructosamine is not removed from having extraneous factors that can impact it in the same way that HbA1c can. So, so absolutely, I do use fructosamine from time to time, but I still always come back to the continuous glucose monitor.
I love that. Yeah, 24-hour continuous glucose monitor. It's hard to beat. Now, I always love to point this out because there's a few people in the carnivore community now calling it animal-based diet who eat hundreds of grams of carbohydrates a day in the form of fruit and honey. And I actually had a discussion with one of these folks. We won't name any names, but he and I are good friends. But he said that the hemoglobin A1c and fructosamine test, they absolutely test for fructose glycation as well as glucose glycation. And I was like, I don't think so, my friend. You maybe need to look into that. And so let's be very clear. Even though fruc is in the name, it only checks for glucose glycation. It does not monitor.
And here's the other problem with fructose is that the glycation potential of fructose is 7 to 10 times greater than that of glucose.
Exactly right. And so these people who are eating lots of fruit and honey are getting a gigantic amount of fructation or fructose glycation that no test at the doctor's office can detect. And so I always like to make that because it's confusing for the layman. Say, well, it says fructosamine. It's got to measure fructose. No, it doesn't. And don't feel bad if you're a layman and you thought that, because some doctors don't know that it only checks for glucose glycation, as does the glycated albumin. They do not check for fructose glycation. And so that's very important for people to understand. Now, are you a big fruit and honey eater as well, or do you believe that's probably not the best choice?
Look, for me, I don't think it's the best choice, but I don't want to be dogmatic about this. So this whole thing about carnivore, it's turned into a bit of a dogma, an ideology, if you will.
Yes.
And my personal belief is that people who are metabolically healthy probably can tolerate certain amounts of sugar. And I have a sneaking suspicion, which I think will be borne out in future, that a lot of these plant food intolerances that we're actually seeing that we didn't see in generations gone by is actually a direct consequence of alterations to the way food is produced. Namely, they're to a lesser extent nutrient deficient and more significantly pesticide adulteration. So in Australia, so here's a pop quiz here for you. So I'm a farmer. I'm growing wheat in Australia. I want to turn it into bread in the future. How many days before I harvest that wheat am I allowed to spray it with Roundup? 6 days. And okay, so if I spray a crop with Roundup, we often do it while it's growing. So the whole thing about GMO modified organisms is not worried about the genetics of it. It's designed to make it resistant to weed killers so we can spray the crap out of them with weed killers so that only one thing grows. That's the whole point of a monocrop.
And now, the reason that they would spray it 6 days before harvest, a lot of people don't know this, Dr. Mason, is that desiccates, that dries the crop out so that it's easier to harvest.
Exactly. It allows for a much more rapid harvest. But often they're not just spraying it on at the end. They're also spraying on it when it's rapidly growing. Now, what do grains do when they're rapidly growing? They take everything up from their environment. So when you've got a crop that's been sprayed by pesticide, it is actually internalized. You cannot break it down by cooking. You cannot wash it off. The rate of pesticide exposure is increasing exponentially. So a World Health Organization report calculating the worldwide per capita for every single person in the world use of pesticides has estimated that in the last 30 years, there's been 11 kilograms of Roundup applied to our food for every person on Earth. And 70% of that has been applied in the last 10 years. I mean, and that's just one single pesticide. You know, there's numerous versions. So this whole thing about, and the pesticides has incredibly wide ranging. I know we probably didn't want to get too much into the weeds on this kind of topic today, but I mean, we have to understand that what this does is it destroys the soil. So all the fungal elements and all these protist elements, the things that are necessary for soil structure are destroyed. Now, sure, that doesn't sound like a big deal, but where does the nutrition, how do we release the nutrients from the sand and the stone and the clay from the soil? It's with these complex ecological, biological forms. And the pesticides just demolish that, which is why when we perform nutrient analysis on fruits and vegetables today compared to earlier, many nutrients are down by at least half, often up to 3/4.
Yep.
And a lot of the data that I've been able to get is still 20, 30 years old, which doesn't incorporate the recent massive increases in fertilizer use. So when I come back and say, look, this is not an ideology about carnivore plant foods versus, so on and so forth, we have to understand that our very food systems are not the same. So sure, if you want to eat plant foods and they agree with you and you're not celiac and you're not reacting to gluten, so on and so forth, then there's no ideological reason why you ought not do that. But I would strongly encourage you to make sure that it is organic. And even if you're eating organic foods, that doesn't completely eliminate your exposure to pesticides, but it has been proven by research to reduce it significantly.